Okay, so welcome to Module 4. In the beginning, there are baselines. So today we're going to take sort of a dive into the world of baselines, something that's really important for virtually all aspects of education and special education, and maybe in particular, in part because the baseline information that one collects is critically related to the benchmarks that are tied to IEP objectives. Without solid baselines, it's virtually impossible to actually create a benchmark. And so this is perhaps one of the more fundamental pieces of data collection, especially surrounding the IEP. But of course, for any kind of intervention that one designs, one typically starts with some kind of baseline information about where the student is, and then uses that information to guide both the design of the intervention as well as the test of the effectiveness of the intervention. So getting the baseline right is an important step in the education of educators. And so what we'll do today is sort of talk about some of the key issues to help people think about how to collect data on baselines and whether one can be confident that the baseline truly represents what's going on with a particular student and whatever disability or need they may have. So what's a baseline? I want to start out with a little bit of an analogy in terms of how to think about the baseline. And to do that, I'd like to help you think that a baseline is kind of like a foundation of some kind of building. It's what you build up from, right? So it's sort of that base, right? That key foundation. And if we ask the question, well, what's a good enough foundation? Well, it really kind of depends on what we're building, right? So if I am creating a little sort of platform foundation for a tent, if I'm going outside and I don't want to have the rain, kind of flood the bottom of my tent, I might build a little bit of a platform just a bit above the ground so that if it does rain and it floods a little bit, the tent is above that and doesn't get wet. So that would be kind of one kind of foundation. If I was building a house, of course, the foundation would have to be different in many ways. It would have to be, wider, obviously, because the house is going to be bigger, and more solid because I'm putting things on top of it that have some weight, unlike the tent, which is cloth and very light. If I'm building a wood house, that's one thing. If I'm building, a stone house, a lot heavier, that's a different kind of thing. And clearly, if I'm building a skyscraper, the foundation needs to be yet bigger again. So what's good enough depends upon kind of what I'm building up above and whether it will hold that structure or not. Again, the baseline is only good enough depending on what you're building. So it's a relational term, right? So what's a good enough base foundation for a structure depends on what you're building. The same thing applies to when we're talking about baselines in education, right? So what's a good enough baseline in education? I can't give a clear answer to that question like, 5, because it really depends on what we're trying to understand. Is it an academic goal around reading, for example, words per minute? Or is it a social emotional goal about collaborating or helping others or comforting others or being kind to others? Or is it a baseline that's for some kind of emotional or physical disability, right? So how far someone can move on their own as opposed to can they operate a wheelchair? So depending on the kind of data I'm looking to collect, my baseline is going to vary. And that's why we can't say, just collect, 5 samples and you'll be good enough, right? So the key thing that I want to start us off with is that there is no specific number or range of baseline samples that kind of defines what's a sufficient or good enough baseline. You'll see often written in documents having to do with IEPs and baselines that you should collect, something like 6 to 8 samples. Well, that number just doesn't make any sense because it really does depend on what we're looking for. And what I hope to share with you today is how to think about the relationship between the baseline and the benchmark, because that's going to set up in some sense what's a sufficient sample given the space we're in or the competency we're looking at within, let's say, an IEP. Okay, so what I'll do now is I want to walk through a series of examples from kind of different aspects of personal competency that may be relevant to educators working on children with different kinds of disabilities, so that we can begin to flesh out the things that might affect a baseline and therefore how we might want to think about the sampling of data for the baseline as it leads into current performance in the IEP and also the establishment of a benchmark. Okay, so let's start with an academic goal, something like an ELA objective that might be, let's say, we want a child to reach 35 words per minute by a certain date. Or let's say, actually much more specifically, let's say that the current baseline we have, let's say, is on average 35 words per minute. Well, often it's stated that we have an average, right? So we have an average count, right, of words per minute, an average or a mean, right? And so the important thing to appreciate about a baseline that's based on an average is that we have a bunch of samples that go into the average. And one of the things that can affect kind of how representative the average is how many samples we have, right? So if I have, a word count of 0 and then a word count of 70 words per minute, and I take the average of those two, I'll get, 35. But the point is, if I have only 2 samples, right, that's not really representative of the child's performance, especially given the variation that I'm seeing. Or, if I have, 40 words per minute and 20 words per minute, and I average those two, I get an average of 30 words per minute. But I've got a difference of 20 words per minute between the first sample and the second, so that might not be representative. The larger the sample we have, the more likely we are to approach an accurate representation of what the average might be. So now the question becomes, well, how many samples am I looking to have? And here one wants to begin to think about the kinds of things that can affect variability in performance of whatever the behavior might be, right? So here we're talking about reading, and you might think, well, if a child has a certain ability to read at a certain speed, there might not be an awful lot of things that might affect that. I mean, if they are reading, whether they're reading in a small group or a larger group, or they're reading on their own, or time of day, these things might have some effect on that. And so you might want to just see, if a child's reading on his or her own, does that make a difference in their speed? If a child has just come off, a difficult type of academic lesson, let's say in math, and now we look at reading, might that be different than if the child's just come off of recess and got a full of energy and maybe excited? Do those things affect it? So we want to have enough samples of reading and words per minute that we're confident there's not too much variation, so that if we report an average, it's representative of the range of variation. Another thing to be careful about with the baseline, and reading is a good example here, is over what time period am I sampling the child's ability to read? One might imagine that if I have something defined, let's say, where in the IEP my current performance is over a period of a couple of weeks, right? There, one might not expect the child's capacity to change much. But if my baseline is over, let's say, a month or 2 months, and there's been breaks in between, like, let's say, school vacations, or the child's been absent, that range of time may contribute to variability and may therefore cloud my interpretation of that baseline information. And then lastly, what are the assessment conditions that I'm giving? And this goes back to the idea that if we're sampling under different conditions, let's say when the child's alone, or at a certain time of day, if there's a lot of variability in the conditions under which that child was tested, I might get variation in my reading, which may not have so much to do with the skill, but maybe the child's distraction, right? So if they're reading at a table with multiple kids around, they may be more distracted, not because their reading skills are poor or great, but they're just distracted. Or if they come in off a bus and they're exhausted, they may read more slowly. It's because they're tired. So we want to make sure that if we can't control for the different kinds of conditions under which a child is assessed, that we can at least see how those different kinds of factors might affect our sample and therefore give us either a stable or an unstable baseline of information. Continuing on with our ELA example and reading words per minute, right? I want people to understand that when we report out on something like an average, and as I mentioned before, an average is made up of multiple samples, okay? And the key thing for people to appreciate is there are a lot of ways to get to an average that may have a tremendous effect on how we think about the relationship between current performance and a baseline and, let's say, the benchmark. But perhaps even more importantly, what happens next in terms of instruction. So let me give a couple of examples of how one could get to an average of 35 and how those differences might impact how we think both about the benchmark and instruction. So let's say I'm shooting for 10 samples, and that's along my horizontal axis or my x-axis, and then along the vertical or y-axis is the words per minute. So let's imagine, in this case, one way of getting to an average of 35. Okay, so here are my data samples. Each little book here in kind of green and white is what I get from a child over the course of 10 samples. Okay, so with an example like this, right, I've got some variation here, that goes, let's say somewhere here, down here around like 30 maybe, and then comes up here to maybe like 40, and it's bouncing around between, 30s and 40s. So on average, right, if we just draw a line through the average of this, we'd get to about 35, okay? But let's imagine a very different kind of sample, a baseline sample, where we get, a very different kind of performance. Here's one, right, where the first sample starts out very low, let's say at 5 or 10 words per minute, but over time the child is just picking up here and getting better and better and better and better. By the time we end on the 10th sample, the reading words per minute is 60. Okay, the child starts at 5, ends at 60. The average of this could be 35. But if we report that the baseline is 35, we are misrepresenting in some sense the child's capacity because he or she is on an upward trajectory, right? By the time they end, they're at 60 words per minute. Therefore, if we set the benchmark to, let's say, 50 words per minute, we'd be actually undercutting what the child's capable of. Moreover, a child who ends up at 60 words per minute, our instructional strategies would be different, right? And again, of course, you can imagine the opposite pattern, right? For whatever reason, the child starts up at 60, but because of lags in between these samples and other kinds of things going on the home front and other kinds of personal things for that child, the child starts at 60, and by the time we're ending at sample 10, ends up at 10. Right? So now again, the average is 35, but they're ending in a different place, and there we're talking about regression, and our instructional strategies again would be very, very different. Lastly, you might imagine a pattern where the child is just all over the place and the variability is very, very high, and there we've got to uncover the cause of that variability. Okay, so the point simply here is that when we report out an average for our current performance or baseline, it's important to take into account the potential variability around that average, because that will affect not only how we set our benchmark, but also how we sort of set up our instruction, and that could be whether it's an intervention or a specific mode of teaching, let's say around reading speed. Okay, let's turn to a different example now. And again, many of these examples, although they'll come from kind of different arenas or areas within special education, therefore different disabilities, some of the issues that arise for baselines will be actually very, very similar. So let's imagine that we're looking at an objective that is that a child will use coping skills when frustrated. Okay? And let's say that we are using a categorical scale. So our scale of measurement for how we're going to assess the child's ability to use coping skills when they're frustrated will be a categorical scale that is articulated as follows. They either never use the coping skills, they rarely used it, they sometimes used it, they often, or they always used it. Okay, and that could be defined based on the time period in which we're looking at. So whenever I see over the course of a day them being frustrated, they never use coping skills. To always, basically every time I see frustration, they always use it. Okay, so we can define those in terms of frequency. Let's say our baseline looks something like the following. Okay, so we have here a pie chart. The colors of the category options correspond to the colors here. So never is represented in red, always in the dark green. And then the percentages are the percentage of time we observe this over time. So what we can see here is that, the at least 50%, or approximately 50% of the time we are watching this child, they are in the never to rarely category. Okay, so this is a child where the baseline is that 50% of the time they're basically infrequently to not at all using their coping skills. Okay, so this presents us with a kind of a puzzle in terms of variation, right? Is that we have 50% where they kind of never or rarely do it, and then 50% where they between sometimes, often, and always do it. What we don't know from this are the conditions under which the child never shows it, rarely shows it, sometimes, and so forth. Okay, so here is variability within a categorical scale, and our job is to understand, well, we've got a baseline where we could certainly create an average, right? But we've got variability, and what we need to understand before we set a benchmark or design an intervention is what are the conditions that lead to the variability in using coping skills for frustration. So we might think, well, did we link our assessment of this baseline information to time of day, right? Because one can imagine that kids might get more or less frustrated during certain times a day. And so what's the relationship between our categorical scale assessment and time of day? What about days of the week? Right? Children who may be having difficult situations at home might find the weekend very kind of difficult and therefore might come into Monday kind of revved up or anxious or, down, depressed, and therefore may start off the week, very dysregulated and therefore in need of a lot of coping skills. And by the end of the week are much more into the groove and the routines of the school and therefore need it much less often. In fact, we may not even see frustration and therefore can't even measure the objective. So days of the week might have an effect on that baseline performance. Lastly, is the context in which we're observing it, right? If we've targeted our assessments for the baseline, let's say only during academic work, then all that we can speak to in terms of our baseline is what the child's ability to use coping skills looks like during academic contexts, right? And that's a limited range of information and therefore limits our use of the baseline. So ideally, if we think that a child's ability to use coping skills when frustrated might be influenced by the context, let's say preferred versus non-preferred activities or social versus less social types of activities, then we ought to sample those within our baseline so that we can make sure we have an accurate picture of what makes them successfully use coping skills and what diminishes that success. Let's now turn to, for a kind of a final sort of, competency areas, let's turn to one about sort of a child maybe with physical disabilities, and we'll look at a motor skill type of baseline question. So let's say that our objective is, Sam will use both hands to grasp frontally placed objects, okay? So here we want to consider, again, ways in which the ability to grasp an object might be influenced by the object itself. So during our baseline, is it just one object or is it many objects? And if it's many objects, have we varied the size, texture, weight, shape, and so forth? Okay, in the example here, these are all round balls, right? So if we only use round balls, then that's what our conclusion must be restricted to in terms of the baseline. If we've used other sized objects and shaped objects and textured objects, and we've got a consistent piece of information on the ability to do that, then we can say that we've got a generalizable baseline that we can build on for future benchmarks or interventions or instruction. Another thing to consider here, which we haven't brought up in the two previous examples, is our objective and the baseline that we're collecting simply a measure of accuracy, kind of they did it or they didn't, or success, they did it or they didn't do it, and or are we layering in the kind of support that was necessary to achieve success, right? So for example, maybe initially, maybe due to eye-hand coordination or the ability to coordinate both hands, the child, misplaces his hands relative to the ball, and prior to the actual grasping, staff member comes in and physically guides the child to the ball. So physical support. Therefore, a baseline can have both what I like to call kind of performance measures, accuracy or success in this case, as well as a level of support measure. And the baseline might want to include both, right? So our performance measure, right, would be that baseline, on 60% of the time when the child grasps frontally placed object, varying in size, texture, and weight, they are successful, and 40% they're not. And during that, on average, it requires at least, 60% of the time is full physical support, right, guiding their hand to the object. Okay, so we want, therefore, to describe both their performance success on the grasping objective, as well as the kind of level of support that we're giving them during that. Because then, for our benchmark, we want to see growth both on success rate as well as possibly on the level of independence that they can use to achieve that success. So let me sum up, right? Basically, solid baselines are essential the same way that the foundation to the house is essential, right? What the baselines give us is an accurate picture of a student's current ability, right? Its current performance. And in order for that to be achieved, we must be confident that we've sufficiently sampled the situation to get that accurate picture, like a snapshot or a portrait, okay? The baseline we collect is the platform for evaluating growth, whether we're talking about a benchmark in an IEP or we're talking about growth performance on some kind of standardized state test. Whatever the measure is, the baseline is critical for our understanding of where the child currently is. It's upon that baseline that we build our instruction, our levels of support, our instructions that are guiding us towards achieving that benchmark. Importantly, and although I haven't spoken too much about this in this module, but we'll eventually get to it in subsequent modules, is that the baseline information is really what guides the design and implementation and evaluation of our interventions. So if I have a child who is not using coping skills successfully when they're frustrated, right? What I want to do, going back to that earlier pie chart, is be able to say, yes, 50% of the time they are able to use some level of coping skills when they're frustrated, and 50% of the time they're not. Okay, so what differentiates those two, right? So when are they successful and when are they not successful? So I dig through that baseline information, right? And I find out, well, the successful times are in the morning because they come in, they're fresh, they're regulated, and they're able to kind of really think about what's going on and then, basically pull in a coping skill. Later in the day, especially when the academics begin to build up, they become less successful, more frustrated, right? And so now what I'm doing is I'm going to design my interventions for the later part of the day during academic instruction because that's where they really need help to achieve that growth. So together, the baselines are giving us a picture of students' current ability, it's a platform for growth, and it's the foundation for designing interventions. I hope this was useful, and you'll too will now be able to collect some very powerful baseline information.